A poor Scottish boy who couldn't afford shoes becomes richer than Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Bill Gates combined, then gives it all away. Andrew Carnegie built a $310 billion empire from absolutely nothing. That's not adjusted for inflation. That's real purchasing power. More wealth than the GDP of most countries today. He controlled 65% of America's steel production, employed 40,000 workers, and owned more railroads than some nations have highways. But what nobody knows is the dark secret behind his fortune. The blood-soaked labor strikes, the manipulated markets, the political corruption that built his empire brick by brick, and the stunning reason he gave away 90% of his wealth before he died. You see, Carnegie didn't just build a business empire. He built the backbone of modern America. Every skyscraper, every bridge, every railroad that connected the nation, it all came from his furnaces. But the cost wasn't just measured in dollars, it was measured in lives. This isn't just another rags to riches story. This is the story of how one man's obsession with efficiency created both the American dream and the American nightmare. How he became the richest human who ever lived, then spent his final years desperately trying to buy back his soul. The man who gave us the phrase, rags to riches, lived it more extremely than anyone before or since, from sleeping on factory floors to owning palaces. From weighing 90 pounds as a teenager to controlling industries that weighed billions of tons. From being nobody to being so powerful that presidents begged for his support. But here's what they don't teach you in school. Carnegie's empire was built on a business model so ruthless, so calculating, that it redefined what capitalism could become. He didn't just compete with rivals, he destroyed them systematically, then bought their wreckage for pennies. And the final twist? The greatest capitalist in history became capitalism's harshest critic, writing essays about why extreme wealth was morally wrong while sitting on the largest fortune ever assembled. This is the story of Andrew Carnegie, steel king, robber baron, philanthropist, and the man who proved that in America, you can become anything, even if it costs you everything. By 1901, Andrew Carnegie was worth approximately $310 billion in today's purchasing power. He owned the largest steel company in the world, controlled vast railroad networks, and employed more workers than entire cities had residents. Presidents consulted him on national policy. Kings invited him to dinner. Wall Street trembled when he spoke. But in 1848, 13-year-old Andrew Carnegie was sleeping on the floor of a textile factory in Pittsburgh, earning $1.20 per week, about $40 in today's money. His family had fled Scotland with nothing after his father's handloom business collapsed. They couldn't afford shoes. They shared a single room with another immigrant family. Andrew worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, operating machinery that could easily kill him. The gap between these two realities seems impossible. How does a starving immigrant boy become the richest human being who ever lived? How do you go from having nothing to controlling everything? What most people don't know is that Carnegie didn't just get lucky or work harder than everyone else. He cracked a code that nobody else understood, the code of industrial capitalism. While other businessmen focused on making products, Carnegie focused on making systems. While they competed on price, he competed on efficiency. While they built businesses, he built monopolies. Behind the success was a mind that operated like a machine. Carnegie memorized every cost, every process, every competitor's weakness. He could recite railroad schedules from memory, calculate steel production costs in his head, and predict market movements months in advance. His brain worked like a computer in an era of slide rules. But this wasn't just about intelligence, it was about obsession. Carnegie believed that extreme wealth was a moral duty, that rich men were trustees of society's progress. He wrote extensively about what he called the gospel of wealth, arguing that successful businessmen had a responsibility to accumulate as much money as possible, then give it all away before they died. This philosophy created a monster. Carnegie pursued profit with religious intensity, squeezing every penny from his operations, even when it meant devastating workers' lives. He paid starvation wages while accumulating unprecedented wealth, justifying it by promising to give the money away later for society's benefit. The America Carnegie entered was transforming rapidly. The Civil War had ended, leaving massive infrastructure needs. Railroads were expanding westward. Cities were growing vertically with new construction techniques. The nation needed steel, massive quantities of it. But steel production in 1865 was still largely a craft industry, with small furnaces and inconsistent quality. Carnegie saw an opportunity that others missed. He realized that steel wasn't just a product, it was the foundation of the entire modern economy. Whoever controlled steel would control everything built with it. Every railroad, every bridge, every building, every machine. It was like controlling the atoms that everything else was made from. Let me take you back to 1848, to a crowded ship crossing the Atlantic, carrying a family with nothing left to lose and a 13-year-old boy whose hunger would reshape the world. What happened next wasn't just the creation of a business empire. It was the birth of modern corporate capitalism, with all its promise and all its brutality. Carnegie didn't just get rich, he invented new ways to get rich that are still used today. But to understand how a poor Scottish immigrant became the king of American industry, we need to go back to the beginning, to a moment when young Andrew Carnegie made his first decision that would echo through history. Chapter 1. Broken Dreams. The hammering stopped on a cold Tuesday morning in 1847, and with it, everything the Carnegie family had ever known died. Andrew Carnegie's father, William, sat staring at his hand loom in their cramped cottage in Dunfermline, Scotland. For generations, the Carnegies had been master weavers, their fingers dancing across threads with inherited skill. But the Industrial Revolution had arrived like a tsunami, washing away centuries of tradition in just a few years. Steam-powered looms in massive factories could produce in one day what William crafted in a month. And they produced it cheaper, faster, more consistently. The math was brutal and undeniable. Hand-loom weavers were extinct. They just didn't know they were dead yet. You see, this wasn't just about one family's tragedy. Across Scotland, thousands of skilled craftsmen watched their livelihoods evaporate as machines replaced human hands. But most of them adapted gradually, finding new trades or accepting factory work. William Carnegie was different. He refused to accept that his life's work had become worthless overnight. For months he continued weaving, even as orders dried up completely. He would wake at dawn and work his loom with desperate intensity, creating beautiful textiles that nobody wanted to buy. Margaret Carnegie, Andrew's mother, watched their savings disappear, while her husband fought a war against progress itself. 12-year-old Andrew understood what his father couldn't accept. The boy would sneak out to watch the new steam factories operating through the night, their mechanical looms producing vast quantities of fabric with mathematical precision. He saw workers tending dozens of machines simultaneously, creating more in an hour than his father produced in a week. The lesson seared itself into young Andrew's mind. Skill without efficiency was worthless. Tradition without adaptation was suicide. Individual craftsmanship couldn't compete with systematic organization. Margaret Carnegie was a force of nature disguised as a working-class Scottish woman. While her husband retreated into denial, she made the impossible decision that would change history. With their last few pounds, she convinced William to sell everything and book passage to America. The decision tore the family apart. William saw it as admission of failure, abandonment of everything their ancestors had built. Margaret saw it as the only chance for survival. Young Andrew saw it as opportunity, his first glimpse of how desperate circumstances could create possibilities for those bold enough to seize them. In May 1848, the Carnegie family boarded a cramped ship in Glasgow with 83 other passengers. They owned 2 trunks containing everything they had left, some clothes, a few tools, and Margaret's fierce determination. The journey took 7 weeks in conditions that would horrify modern travelers. But here's what's remarkable. While other immigrants huddled in despair, young Andrew treated the voyage like a business school. He studied every passenger, learning their trades and destinations. He memorized shipping schedules and cargo manifests. He calculated costs and profits for imaginary ventures. The boy who couldn't afford shoes was already thinking like a capitalist. When they reached New York, the family had $7.50 left, about $250 in today's money. They took the cheapest transport to Pittsburgh, where Margaret's sister lived, arriving with nothing but hope and debt. Their first home in America was a basement room shared with another immigrant family. 6 people, 1 window, no privacy. William found occasional work at a cotton factory for $5 per week. Margaret took in washing and binding shoes to earn extra pennies. Young Andrew was immediately sent to work as a bobbin boy at a textile mill for $1.20 per week. The Anchor Cotton Works was a nightmare of noise, heat and danger. Steam engines roared constantly. Massive machines operated without safety guards. Children as young as 9 worked 12-hour shifts, their small fingers threading bobbins under moving machinery that could crush bones in seconds. Andrew's job was simple but crucial: replace empty bobbins with full ones as the spinning machines consumed thread. Miss a replacement and production stopped. Move too slowly and angry supervisors would dock your pay. Make a mistake and you might lose a finger or hand. Most children in Andrew's position accepted their fate, working until adulthood, then becoming low-skilled factory hands for life. The system was designed to trap immigrants in perpetual poverty, providing just enough income to survive, but never enough to escape. But Andrew Carnegie was studying the system while working within it. He noticed which supervisors got promoted and why. He observed how different sections of the factory operated with varying efficiency. He memorized production numbers and began calculating profit margins in his head. Late at night, by candlelight in their shared basement room, Andrew would practice writing and arithmetic. While his exhausted parents slept, he taught himself accounting principles and business English. Margaret noticed her son's obsession and began saving pennies for books and newspapers. The breakthrough came when Andrew discovered the Allegheny Library, a small collection of books that working boys could borrow for free. Every Sunday, his only day off, he would walk miles to read everything available about business, science, and successful men's biographies. Here's what separated Andrew from every other immigrant worker. He understood that knowledge was leverage. While others saw their daily labor as an end in itself, he saw it as research into how industrial systems operated. Every boring hour operating bobbins was actually a masterclass in efficiency and management. After 18 months at Anchor Cotton Works, Andrew made his first strategic career move. He learned that telegraph operators earned significantly more than factory workers, and that the Pennsylvania Railroad was hiring messengers. The job required running messages through Pittsburgh streets, but it also meant exposure to the emerging telegraph industry. At 14, Andrew applied for a messenger position with O'Reilly's Telegraph Company. The job paid $2.50 per week, more than double his textile factory wages. But more importantly, it placed him at the center of Pittsburgh's business communications network. Within weeks, Andrew had memorized every street in Pittsburgh and knew the major businessmen by sight. He studied their habits, their associates, their business patterns. He delivered their most confidential messages and observed how deals were structured and negotiations conducted. The telegraph office became Andrew's business university. He learned to operate the telegraph equipment, studied market reports from New York and Chicago, and began understanding how information moved faster than goods, and how that speed differential could create profit opportunities. But the real education happened when Andrew started arriving early and staying late, volunteering to handle overflow work without extra pay. This gave him access to more confidential communications and allowed him to study successful businessmen's private correspondence. By 1851, 16-year-old Andrew Carnegie had accumulated 3 years of intensive business education disguised as manual labor. He understood factory operations, urban logistics, communication networks, and market information flows. Most importantly, he had identified the pattern that would make him the richest man in history. The pattern was simple but revolutionary. In an industrial economy, information and efficiency were more valuable than raw materials or manual skill. Whoever could organize resources most effectively, move information fastest, and scale operations largest would dominate entire industries. Andrew had found his calling, but first he needed to escape the messenger service and position himself where real power flowed. And he had identified exactly where that was: the Pennsylvania Railroad, the most powerful corporation in America. The 18 months Andrew spent as a telegraph messenger weren't just a job, they were reconnaissance. He was mapping the power structure of American capitalism from the inside, learning who controlled what and how they did it. Soon, he would use that knowledge to begin his systematic conquest of American industry. But first, He had to convince the Pennsylvania Railroad that a 17-year-old Scottish immigrant could help them become even more powerful than they already were. Chapter 2: Railroad Gamble. Thomas Scott was the most feared man in Pennsylvania, and 17-year-old Andrew Carnegie was about to walk into his office with nothing but audacity and a plan. Scott ran the Pennsylvania Railroad's Western Division like a military operation. He controlled thousands of miles of track, employed tens of thousands of workers, and moved more cargo than most nations' entire transportation systems. Railroad executives in 1852 were essentially unelected kings, with power over entire regions' economic fate. Carnegie had studied Scott for months while delivering telegraph messages to his office. The man was brilliant, but overwhelmed, constantly juggling scheduling crises, equipment failures, and political pressures. Carnegie realized that Scott needed what every powerful man desperately requires, but rarely finds: someone absolutely loyal who could multiply his capabilities. The opportunity came when Carnegie learned that Scott's personal telegraph operator was leaving. Instead of applying through normal channels, Andrew did something that would become his signature move for the next 50 years. He created an irresistible value proposition. Carnegie spent 2 weeks mapping every operational inefficiency in the Pennsylvania Railroad's telegraph communications. He identified delayed message delivery routes, redundant reporting requirements, and communication bottlenecks that cost the railroad thousands of dollars monthly. Then he wrote a detailed proposal showing exactly how a new telegraph operator could save the company money while improving service. When Carnegie finally entered Scott's office in February 1853, he didn't just ask for a job, he presented a business plan. At 17, with only elementary education, this immigrant boy was consulting to one of America's most powerful corporations. Scott hired him immediately at $35 per month, nearly 6 times his messenger wages. But here's what made this moment historically significant. Carnegie didn't just want employment. He wanted education in how power actually worked. He positioned himself as Scott's unofficial deputy, volunteering for every challenging assignment and systematically learning railroad operations from the inside. Within months, Carnegie had made himself indispensable. He memorized train schedules across the entire Pennsylvania system. He could track cargo shipments mentally and predict arrival times more accurately than experienced dispatchers. Most importantly, he began identifying profit opportunities that others missed. The breakthrough came during a massive train wreck near Pittsburgh that threatened to shut down the entire Western Division for weeks. Scott was in Philadelphia when the crisis hit, leaving Carnegie temporarily in charge of operations. A 17-year-old immigrant was suddenly managing one of America's largest transportation networks. Carnegie's response revealed the strategic thinking that would later build his steel empire. Instead of simply clearing the wreckage and resuming normal operations, he redesigned the entire traffic flow system. He rerouted trains through alternative paths, reorganized cargo loading procedures, and implemented new communication protocols that prevented similar accidents. When Scott returned, he found that Carnegie had not only solved the immediate crisis, but had permanently improved the railroad's efficiency. Operations were running smoother than before the accident, and several cost-saving innovations had been implemented. This success established Carnegie's reputation as someone who didn't just solve problems, he transformed systems. Scott began involving him in increasingly important decisions, essentially treating a teenage employee as a business partner. But Carnegie was learning something more valuable than railroad management. He was studying how large corporations accumulated and exercised power. The Pennsylvania Railroad didn't just transport goods, it controlled regional economic development, influenced political decisions, and shaped entire industries through its pricing and routing choices. Carnegie observed how Scott built relationships with suppliers, manipulated competitors, and leveraged political connections. He watched negotiations where millions of dollars changed hands based on personal relationships and information advantages. He learned that business success wasn't primarily about operational excellence, it was about controlling the systems that others depended on. In 1856, Scott offered Carnegie his first real lesson in capitalism, a chance to invest in the Adams Express Company. The investment required $600, more money than Carnegie's family had ever possessed, but Scott offered to arrange financing, essentially betting on his protégé's future earning potential. This investment decision would haunt Carnegie's critics for decades. Here was a young man earning $40 per month, borrowing $600 to buy stocks based on inside information from his boss. It was either brilliant entrepreneurship or corporate corruption, depending on your perspective. Carnegie's mother, Margaret, was terrified by the debt but understood the opportunity. She mortgaged their small house to provide additional capital, betting everything on her son's judgment. It was a family decision that revealed both their desperation and their ambition. The Adams Express investment paid dividends immediately, literally. Within a year, Carnegie was earning more from his stock dividends than from his railroad salary. He had discovered the fundamental secret of capitalism: ownership generated wealth faster than labor. But here's where Carnegie's story becomes different from other Gilded Age success stories. Instead of simply accumulating investments, he began studying how successful companies operated internally. He wanted to understand what made some businesses profitable while others failed. Carnegie started visiting other companies' facilities, studying their production processes and management techniques. He analyzed their cost structures, efficiency measures, and competitive advantages. He was reverse engineering successful capitalism like a scientist studying specimens. The pattern he discovered would define his entire career. The most profitable companies weren't necessarily those with the best products or services. They were companies that could produce acceptable quality at consistently lower costs than competitors. This insight led to Carnegie's first independent business venture. In 1857, he identified a gap in the railroad industry: sleeping cars for long-distance passengers. Existing sleeping cars were uncomfortable and poorly designed, creating an opportunity for someone who could build better ones more efficiently. Carnegie partnered with Theodore Woodruff to form the Woodruff Sleeping Car Company. But instead of simply copying existing designs, Carnegie applied his efficiency obsession to every aspect of production. He standardized components, streamlined manufacturing processes, and negotiated volume discounts with suppliers. The sleeping car business became Carnegie's laboratory for testing his theories about industrial efficiency. He tracked every cost, timed every process, and continuously refined operations based on data rather than tradition. Within 3 years, the Woodruff Sleeping Car Company dominated its market. But more importantly, Carnegie had proven his theory that systematic efficiency could overcome any competition. Companies that operated based on tradition, intuition, or craftsmanship couldn't compete with businesses that operated like machines. By 1859, 24-year-old Andrew Carnegie was earning more than $50,000 annually from various investments, equivalent to roughly $1.5 million today. He had transformed from a poor immigrant to a wealthy capitalist in just 11 years. But Carnegie wasn't satisfied with personal wealth. He had identified a much larger opportunity that would require everything he had learned about efficiency, information, and power. The American economy was about to explode with westward expansion, urban development, and industrial growth. All of that growth would require massive amounts of steel. The problem was that American steel production in 1860 was still primitive compared to new techniques being developed in Europe. Most American steel was inconsistent in quality, expensive to produce, and insufficient in quantity for the nation's growing needs. Carnegie realized that whoever could master efficient steel production would essentially control the backbone of the entire American economy. Every railroad, bridge, building, and machine would depend on their product. This wasn't just a business opportunity, it was a chance to own the foundation that everything else would be built on. But first, Carnegie needed to learn everything about steel production. From the chemistry of smelting to the economics of large-scale manufacturing, he needed to study the most advanced techniques in the world and figure out how to implement them more efficiently than anyone had ever achieved. The Scottish immigrant who had started as a bobbin boy was about to begin his systematic conquest of American industry. But he would discover that building a steel empire required more than efficiency and information. It required a willingness to crush anyone who stood in the way. Chapter 3: Oil Strategy. While America tore itself apart in civil war, Andrew Carnegie was quietly positioning himself to profit from whatever emerged from the chaos. The year 1861 brought an unprecedented opportunity disguised as a national catastrophe. The Union needed massive quantities of steel for weapons, railroads, and infrastructure. Meanwhile, a new industry was emerging in western Pennsylvania that most businessmen didn't understand: petroleum. Carnegie understood both the immediate opportunity and the long-term implications. War would accelerate industrialization, creating enormous demand for steel and transportation. But the discovery of oil near Titusville, Pennsylvania, represented something even more valuable: a new energy source that could power the next phase of economic development. While other investors rushed into obvious war-related businesses, Carnegie took a different approach. He studied the underlying systems that would determine long-term economic winners, regardless of who won the war. His analysis led to a startling conclusion: transportation and energy would be more valuable than manufacturing. Whoever controlled how goods moved and what powered production would control entire industries. Carnegie's first major wartime investment seemed almost mundane. He purchased shares in the Columbia Oil Company, which owned drilling rights in Pennsylvania's oil regions. But this wasn't speculation. It was strategic positioning based on careful analysis of emerging market dynamics. The Pennsylvania oil fields in 1862 were chaotic and dangerous. Hundreds of independent drillers competed frantically for the best sites. Most had no business experience and little capital, leading to massive waste and frequent failures. But beneath the surface chaos, Carnegie recognized patterns that others missed. He realized that oil production would follow the same efficiency principles that applied to railroads and manufacturing. Currently, the industry operated through countless small, inefficient operations. Eventually, larger companies with superior organization would dominate by reducing costs and improving consistency. But Carnegie didn't want to operate oil wells directly. Instead, he positioned himself to profit from the industry's growth without bearing operational risks. He invested in transportation systems that would carry oil to market, regardless of which individual companies succeeded or failed. Carnegie's Columbia Oil investment returned 300% profits in its first year. But more importantly, it gave him intimate knowledge of how new industries developed from chaos into organized markets. Meanwhile, his railroad connections were generating enormous wartime profits. The Pennsylvania Railroad was carrying unprecedented cargo loads, and Carnegie's sleeping car business benefited from increased passenger traffic. His various investments were returning more annual income than most people earned in a lifetime. By 1863, Carnegie was wealthy enough to avoid military service by paying for a substitute, a common practice among successful businessmen. Critics later attacked this decision as unpatriotic, but Carnegie's response revealed his strategic thinking. He could contribute more to the Union cause by maximizing industrial production than by carrying a rifle. The war was teaching Carnegie crucial lessons about how governments and businesses interacted during crises. He observed how military contracts were awarded, how political connections influenced business opportunities, and how national emergencies could accelerate economic change. These observations would shape his approach to business for the rest of his career. Carnegie learned that successful capitalists didn't just respond to market conditions, they positioned themselves to benefit from government policies and social changes. In 1864, Carnegie made his boldest investment yet. He borrowed heavily to purchase significant stakes in multiple oil companies and transportation systems. The debt terrified his mother, but Carnegie had calculated that the risk was actually minimal. His analysis was based on a simple insight: America's post-war economy would require massive amounts of energy, and oil was becoming the most efficient energy source available. Regardless of which specific companies succeeded, the overall industry would experience explosive growth. Carnegie's strategy was to own pieces of the infrastructure that all oil companies would need to use. Instead of betting on individual drilling operations, he invested in pipelines, refineries, and transportation systems that would profit from the industry's overall expansion. This approach, focusing on systems rather than individual businesses, became Carnegie's signature strategy for the rest of his career. He consistently invested in infrastructure that other companies would depend on rather than competing directly in end product markets. The strategy paid off spectacularly. By 1865, Carnegie's oil-related investments were generating massive returns, and he had established relationships throughout the emerging petroleum industry. But more importantly, he had proven his theory about systematic investing. However, Carnegie was already identifying the next big opportunity. His railroad experience had shown him that America's transportation infrastructure was inadequate for post-war economic expansion. The nation needed thousands of miles of new railroad track, hundreds of bridges, and countless buildings. All of that construction would require steel, massive quantities of high-quality steel that American producers couldn't currently supply efficiently. Carnegie began studying steel production with the same intensity he had applied to railroads and oil. He visited steel mills throughout Pennsylvania, analyzed their production methods, and calculated their cost structures. What he discovered convinced him that steel would be the foundation of America's industrial future. But the American steel industry in 1865 was primitive compared to new techniques being developed in Britain. Most American steel was produced in small quantities, using outdated methods. Quality was inconsistent, costs were high, and production capacity was insufficient for the nation's growing needs. Carnegie realized that whoever could implement efficient steel production using the latest technology would dominate the American market for decades. It wasn't just a business opportunity, it was a chance to control the raw material that the entire modern economy would be built with. In late 1865, Carnegie made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He would sell his other investments and focus entirely on steel production. Not just any steel production, but the most efficient steel operation ever created. Carnegie spent months traveling through Britain, studying the latest steel-making techniques and equipment. He visited the most advanced facilities, learned about new chemical processes, and analyzed the most efficient organizational methods. What he discovered was the Bessemer process, a revolutionary technique that could produce large quantities of high-quality steel much more efficiently than traditional methods. But implementing the Bessemer process required massive capital investment and sophisticated technical knowledge. Most American businessmen saw the Bessemer process as too risky and expensive. Carnegie saw it as the foundation of a monopoly. Whoever implemented the technology first and most efficiently would have insurmountable advantages over all competitors. In 1866, Carnegie partnered with Henry Phipps and other investors to form the Cyclops Iron Company, specifically designed around implementing the Bessemer process in America. But this wasn't just about adopting new technology. Carnegie was planning to revolutionize the entire industry through systematic efficiency. The company was structured around principles Carnegie had learned from studying railroads and oil operations. Every process would be measured and optimized. Every cost would be tracked and minimized. Every operational decision would be based on data rather than tradition. Carnegie's steel venture represented more than just another business investment. It was his attempt to prove that systematic efficiency could create unprecedented profits while revolutionizing an entire industry. But implementing this vision would require confronting established competitors, managing complex technology, and organizing massive industrial operations. Carnegie would need to apply everything he had learned about power, efficiency, and capitalism to build something that had never existed before. The Scottish immigrant who had started as a factory worker was about to begin constructing the largest steel empire in human history. But building that empire would require decisions that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Carnegie was about to discover that controlling the foundation of the modern economy came with a terrible price, not just in dollars, but in human suffering that would stain his legacy forever. Chapter 4: Steel Revolution. The first time Andrew Carnegie saw molten steel flowing from a Bessemer converter, he knew he was watching the future reshape itself in real time. It was 1872, and Carnegie stood in the blazing heat of his new Edgar Thomson steelworks, watching 15 tons of iron transform into high-quality steel in just 15 minutes. Traditional methods required hours or days for the same conversion. This wasn't just technological improvement, It was the industrial equivalent of discovering fire. But here's what separated Carnegie from every other businessman watching similar demonstrations. While others marveled at the technology, Carnegie was calculating the economic implications with mathematical precision. The numbers were staggering. The Bessemer process could produce steel at roughly 1/3 the cost of traditional methods, with superior quality and consistency. More importantly, it could scale to massive volumes that traditional steelmaking could never achieve. Carnegie realized he wasn't just building a steel company. He was positioning himself to control the raw material that would define the next century of human development. Every skyscraper, every bridge, every railroad, every machine would depend on steel production. Whoever controlled steel efficiently would essentially control the pace of civilization itself. The Edgar Thomson works represented Carnegie's complete break from traditional business thinking. While other steel companies focused on maintaining established practices and gradual improvements, Carnegie designed his operation around revolutionary efficiency principles. Every aspect of the facility was engineered for systematic optimization. The plant layout minimized material handling distances. Production processes were standardized and measured constantly. Workers were trained in precise techniques and held to exacting standards. But Carnegie's real innovation wasn't technological. It was organizational. He implemented cost accounting systems that tracked expenses with unprecedented detail. Every pound of raw material, every hour of labor, every piece of equipment was monitored and optimized continuously. This obsessive measurement revealed opportunities that other companies never noticed. Carnegie discovered that minor adjustments to furnace temperatures could reduce fuel costs by significant percentages. He found that scheduling changes could increase production capacity without additional equipment. Most importantly, he learned that efficiency improvements compounded exponentially when applied systematically. Within 2 years, the Edgar Thomson Works was producing steel at costs that competitors couldn't match. Carnegie could undersell established companies while maintaining higher profit margins, a competitive advantage that seemed almost impossible. But Carnegie wasn't satisfied with simply being more efficient than existing competitors. He wanted to create barriers to entry so high that potential rivals would never attempt to challenge his position. His strategy was vertical integration on an unprecedented scale. Instead of buying raw materials from suppliers, Carnegie purchased iron ore mines. Instead of relying on transportation companies, he bought railroad lines and shipping fleets. Instead of using external financing, he reinvested profits to expand production capacity continuously. By 1875, Carnegie controlled every aspect of steel production from ore extraction to final product delivery. This integration allowed him to optimize the entire supply chain and eliminate profit margins that would otherwise go to suppliers and intermediaries. The competitive advantages were overwhelming. Carnegie's integrated operation could produce steel more efficiently than companies that operated only one piece of the value chain. His control over raw materials protected him from price fluctuations that devastated competitors. His transportation assets allowed him to serve customers that rivals couldn't reach profitably. But vertical integration also required massive capital investments that strained even Carnegie's substantial resources. Building mines, railroads, and manufacturing facilities simultaneously demanded more money than traditional financing could provide. Carnegie's solution revealed his sophisticated understanding of corporate finance. Instead of borrowing from banks or issuing public stock, he convinced his suppliers and customers to become investors in his integrated operation. Railroad companies that needed Carnegie's steel invested in his operations to secure reliable supply. Mining companies that sold him or accepted payment in company shares rather than cash. Equipment manufacturers that built his facilities became partial owners of the businesses they were helping to create. This approach created a network of aligned interests that reinforced Carnegie's competitive position. His suppliers had incentives to provide the best materials at favorable prices. His customers had reasons to prefer his steel over competitors' products. His business partners were motivated to support his expansion rather than compete against him. By 1878, Carnegie Steel was producing more than any competitor and selling at prices that made competition nearly impossible. But Carnegie's ambitions extended far beyond dominating existing markets. He wanted to create entirely new demand for steel products. Carnegie began promoting steel construction for buildings, bridges, and infrastructure projects throughout America. He worked with architects and engineers to develop new applications for steel that had never been attempted. He lobbied government officials to specify steel requirements for public projects. This demand creation strategy transformed Carnegie from a supplier serving existing markets into a visionary shaping the entire economy's direction. He wasn't just selling steel, he was selling the future that steel could build. The results exceeded even Carnegie's ambitious expectations. American steel consumption increased dramatically as builders discovered steel's advantages over traditional materials. Cities began constructing steel-framed skyscrapers that enabled unprecedented urban density. Railroads expanded westward using steel rails that could handle heavier loads than iron alternatives. Carnegie's company grew along with the expanding demand, but growth brought new challenges that tested his management philosophy. Managing thousands of workers across multiple facilities required organizational capabilities that few businesses had ever developed. Carnegie's approach to labor management reflected his efficiency obsession, but created tensions that would eventually explode into violence. He implemented piece-rate payment systems that rewarded productivity but pushed workers to their physical limits. He standardized work processes that eliminated inefficiency but reduced worker autonomy and craftsmanship. Workers appreciated the higher wages that Carnegie's efficient operations could support, but they resented the intense pace and rigid control that his systems required. Labor organizers began arguing that Carnegie's prosperity came at workers' expense, setting the stage for confrontations that would define his legacy. Meanwhile, Carnegie continued expanding his operations relentlessly. He acquired competing steel companies and integrated them into his system. He purchased additional mines and transportation assets. He invested in new technologies that could further reduce production costs. By 1880, Carnegie Steel employed more than 8,000 workers and produced approximately 25% of America's steel. The company's annual revenues exceeded those of most states' entire economies. Carnegie himself had become one of the wealthiest individuals in human history. But success brought scrutiny from competitors, politicians, and critics who argued that Carnegie's dominance was harmful to American economic competition. Accusations of monopolistic practices and unfair business methods began appearing regularly in newspapers and political speeches. Carnegie's response revealed both his business acumen and his capacity for self-justification. He argued that efficient large-scale operations benefited society by providing better products at lower prices. He claimed that his success resulted from superior management rather than unfair practices. He insisted that competition remained possible for any company willing to match his efficiency standards. These arguments contained significant truth, but they also ignored the human costs of Carnegie's relentless pursuit of efficiency. Workers in Carnegie's mills faced dangerous conditions, exhausting schedules, and constant pressure to increase productivity. Communities dependent on his operations had little choice but to accept whatever terms Carnegie offered. The contradiction between Carnegie's public philosophy and private practices was becoming increasingly apparent. He wrote extensively about businessmen's moral responsibilities while implementing policies that many considered exploitative. He advocated for workers' rights in theory while opposing labor organization in practice. This tension would eventually force Carnegie to confront fundamental questions about capitalism's moral implications. But in 1880, those questions seemed abstract compared to the immediate opportunities that continued expanding before him. Carnegie had proven that systematic efficiency could create unprecedented wealth and transform entire industries. Now he faced the challenge of managing that wealth's social and political consequences while continuing to expand his empire's reach and influence. Chapter 5. Monopoly Machine. By 1885, Andrew Carnegie wasn't just running a steel company, he was operating a wealth-generating machine so efficient that it defied economic logic. The numbers were almost incomprehensible. Carnegie Steel was producing 2,000 tons of steel daily at a cost per ton that competitors couldn't match, even with government subsidies. The company's annual profits exceeded $40 million, equivalent to roughly $1.2 billion today, while simultaneously lowering prices for customers. Carnegie had achieved what economists considered impossible: a monopoly that benefited consumers through lower prices while generating unprecedented profits for owners. But here's what made Carnegie's dominance truly revolutionary. He hadn't achieved it through the traditional monopoly tactics of price manipulation or market control. Instead, he had built a system so efficient that competing against it was economically suicidal. The secret was Carnegie's obsession with what he called hard driving, the relentless pursuit of cost reduction through systematic optimization. Every process in his integrated operation was continuously analyzed and improved. Every expense was tracked and justified. Every operational decision was based on detailed cost accounting that most companies didn't even attempt. Carnegie's cost accounting systems were decades ahead of standard business practices. While competitors estimated expenses and hoped for profits, Carnegie knew precisely what every ton of steel cost to produce, transport, and sell. This information advantage allowed him to make pricing decisions that seemed impossible to rivals. For example, Carnegie could sell steel at prices that appeared to offer minimal profits, while actually maintaining substantial margins through superior efficiency. Competitors who tried to match these prices discovered they were selling below cost, forcing them either to exit the market or operate at devastating losses. The psychological impact on competitors was as important as the economic pressure. Business leaders who had dominated regional markets for decades found themselves unable to compete with a company that seemed to operate by different rules entirely. Many established steel companies simply gave up trying to compete directly with Carnegie. Instead, they focused on specialized niche markets or accepted roles as secondary suppliers in regions that Carnegie considered insufficiently profitable to serve directly. But Carnegie's strategy extended beyond simply outcompeting existing rivals. He was actively preventing new competition from emerging. His vertical integration created barriers to entry that seemed almost insurmountable to potential competitors. Anyone wanting to compete with Carnegie Steel would need to simultaneously enter iron ore mining, steel production, transportation, and marketing. The capital requirements were staggering, and Carnegie's control over high-quality ore deposits made accessing raw materials extremely difficult. Moreover, Carnegie's relationships with railroad companies created transportation advantages that competitors couldn't match. His volumes were so large that railroads offered him freight rates unavailable to smaller shippers. His integrated transportation assets allowed him to serve customers that rivals couldn't reach profitably. Carnegie also leveraged his success to attract the best talent available. He offered profit-sharing arrangements that made his key managers wealthy, creating loyalty that went beyond normal employment relationships. These managers understood Carnegie's systems intimately and could implement efficiency improvements that maintained his competitive advantages. The profit-sharing structure also aligned his managers' interests with long-term company success rather than short-term performance. This encouraged investments in efficiency improvements and customer relationships that competitors focused on quarterly results couldn't match. By 1887, Carnegie's integrated empire included 74,000 acres of iron ore deposits, 1,000 miles of railroad track, dozens of production facilities, and a fleet of Great Lakes shipping vessels. The operation employed more than 13,000 workers and served customers throughout North America and Europe. But Carnegie's ambitions extended beyond steel production itself. He began diversifying into related industries where his efficiency principles could create similar competitive advantages. Carnegie invested heavily in coke production, the fuel essential for steel manufacturing. By controlling high-quality coke supplies, he could ensure consistent furnace performance while creating another barrier to potential competitors. Companies that couldn't access premium coke couldn't match Carnegie's steel quality or production efficiency. He also expanded into wire manufacturing, structural steel fabrication, and specialty alloy production. Each diversification leveraged Carnegie's core advantages while creating additional revenue streams that reinforced his market position. The diversification strategy revealed Carnegie's sophisticated understanding of economic moats, competitive advantages that became stronger over time rather than eroding through normal market forces. Carnegie's moats included his cost advantages, supplier relationships, transportation assets, technical expertise, and customer loyalty. But the most powerful moat was his company's culture of continuous improvement, which ensured that efficiency advantages increased rather than diminished as the business matured. However, Carnegie's dominance was creating political problems that threatened his entire empire. Politicians, newspapers, and reform organizations increasingly criticized his monopolistic power and its effects on workers and communities. The criticism focused on what opponents called the Carnegie system, business practices that prioritized efficiency over human welfare. Critics argued that Carnegie's wealth came at the expense of workers who endured dangerous conditions, long hours, and constant pressure to increase productivity. Labor organizers pointed out that Carnegie's profits were rising much faster than workers' wages, despite productivity improvements that should have benefited everyone involved in the operation. They argued that Carnegie's efficiency came from exploiting rather than fairly compensating the workers who made it possible. Carnegie's response to these criticisms revealed both his business acumen and his capacity for self-deception. He argued that his efficient operations provided more jobs at higher wages than less efficient competitors could offer. He claimed that his success benefited society by making steel more affordable and accessible. These arguments contained significant truth. Carnegie's steel was indeed cheaper and higher quality than alternatives, and his operations did provide employment for thousands of families, but the arguments also ignored the human costs of his relentless efficiency demands. Carnegie genuinely believed that his business practices were morally justified because they created overall social benefits. He saw himself as a progressive force modernizing American industry and improving living standards through technological advancement and organizational efficiency. This self-image was reinforced by Carnegie's growing involvement in philanthropy and social reform. He began donating substantial amounts to libraries, schools, and cultural institutions, arguing that successful businessmen had moral obligations to use their wealth for society's benefit. But the contradiction between Carnegie's philanthropic ideals and business practices was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. Critics pointed out that Carnegie was simultaneously creating and attempting to solve social problems, accumulating wealth through practices that harmed workers, then donating portions of that wealth to institutions that might help address the resulting social needs. By 1890, Carnegie Steel was generating annual profits exceeding $50 million, while Carnegie himself was worth approximately $200 million, equivalent to roughly $60 billion today. He had achieved a level of wealth and market control that seemed almost feudal in its scope and power. But Carnegie's empire was about to face its greatest challenge, a confrontation with organized labor that would force him to choose between his efficiency obsessions and his humanitarian ideals. The choice he made would define his historical legacy and reveal the true character of the man behind America's greatest industrial fortune. The conflict that was building would test everything Carnegie believed about business, morality, and his own identity. It would force him to confront the human costs of his pursuit of efficiency and decide whether his wealth was worth the price that others were paying to create it. Chapter 6. Bloody Strike, July 6, 1892. Homestead, Pennsylvania, 3 a.m. 300 armed Pinkerton agents floated down the Monongahela River on barges, preparing to storm Carnegie's steel mill and break the most important labor strike in American history. By sunrise, 10 men would be dead, dozens wounded, and Andrew Carnegie's reputation would be stained with blood that no amount of philanthropy could ever wash clean. But this violence didn't emerge from nowhere. It was the inevitable result of a system that treated human beings as production costs to be minimized, regardless of the consequences. The trouble began in 1889, when Carnegie's partnership agreement with his workers at the Homestead Steel Works was scheduled for renewal. The existing contract had maintained an uneasy peace between Carnegie's efficiency demands and workers' need for decent wages and working conditions. But Carnegie's business philosophy had evolved since signing the original agreement. He now viewed labor costs as the primary obstacle to maximizing efficiency and profits. Workers who had once been valued partners in building his empire were increasingly seen as expenses to be reduced. Carnegie's new partner, Henry Clay Frick, shared this perspective but with even less concern for workers' welfare. Frick had built his reputation crushing labor organizing in the coke industry, using tactics that other businessmen considered unnecessarily brutal. The partnership between Carnegie and Frick created a deadly combination. Carnegie's efficiency obsession merged with Frick's willingness to use any methods necessary to control workers and maximize profits. When contract negotiations began in 1892, Frick demanded major concessions from workers. He wanted to eliminate guaranteed minimum wages, extend working hours, reduce safety requirements, and ban union organization. These demands would essentially convert skilled steelworkers into replaceable factory hands with no job security or bargaining power. The workers' response was immediate and unified. They refused to accept terms that would destroy their livelihoods and dignity. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, representing Homestead's skilled workers, called for a strike rather than accepting Frick's demands. But here's what made this conflict different from typical labor disputes. Carnegie and Frick had prepared for confrontation with military precision. They had secretly recruited replacement workers, accumulated weapons and supplies, and arranged for private security forces to occupy the plant. Carnegie himself wasn't present during the negotiations. He had conveniently departed for a vacation in Scotland, allowing Frick to implement harsh measures while maintaining plausible deniability about specific tactics used. This calculated absence revealed Carnegie's sophisticated understanding of public relations management. He could benefit from Frick's union-breaking efforts while avoiding direct responsibility for any violence or controversy that might result. On June 30, 1892, Frick locked out all Homestead workers and announced that the plant would reopen with replacement workers under new terms that eliminated union representation entirely. The lockout affected 3,800 workers and their families, essentially the entire community of Homestead. The workers' response surprised Frick with its organization and determination. Instead of dispersing in defeat, they established armed picket lines around the plant and organized community support for the strike. Homestead became a worker-controlled town where no replacement workers or company security could operate safely. For 6 days, the standoff continued with neither side willing to compromise. Frick controlled the plant but couldn't operate it with replacement workers. The union controlled the community but couldn't earn wages while the plant remained closed. Frick's solution was characteristically brutal and direct. He hired 300 Pinkerton agents to assault the plant and forcibly break the workers' resistance. The Pinkertons were essentially a private army that wealthy businessmen used to suppress labor organizing through intimidation and violence. The Pinkerton assault began at dawn on July 6th, when armed agents attempted to land at the plant's river entrance. But the workers were prepared for violence and had armed themselves for defense. What followed was a pitched battle that lasted 12 hours and shocked the entire nation. Workers fired rifles and cannons at the Pinkerton barges, while agents returned fire with military weapons. Explosions and gunfire echoed across the Monongahela River as the two forces engaged in what was essentially urban warfare. The battle's turning point came when workers poured oil on the river and attempted to burn the Pinkerton barges. Faced with potential incineration, the agents surrendered and agreed to leave Homestead under worker supervision. But the workers' victory was brief and brutal. As the surrendered Pinkertons marched through Homestead under supposed safe passage, angry crowds attacked them with clubs, stones, and fists. Several agents were beaten severely, and the violence continued until local officials intervened. The images of bloodied Pinkertons being assaulted by workers became national news, shifting public sympathy away from the strikers despite their legitimate grievances. Carnegie and Frick successfully portrayed themselves as victims of worker violence rather than perpetrators of labor suppression. 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons died in the battle, with dozens more wounded. But the human cost extended far beyond immediate casualties. Families lost their primary income source, community relationships were shattered, and workers' faith in American democracy was severely damaged. Pennsylvania's governor responded to the violence by sending 8,000 National Guard troops to occupy Homestead and protect replacement workers. The military occupation allowed Frick to reopen the plant with non-union labor, while striking workers watched their jobs disappear. The irony was devastating. Workers who had built Carnegie's empire and generated his unprecedented wealth were now prevented by military force from earning the wages they needed to survive. Carnegie's response to the crisis revealed both his business acumen and his moral bankruptcy. From Scotland, he issued public statements expressing regret about the violence, while privately congratulating Frick for breaking the union effectively. Carnegie understood that the Homestead defeat would discourage labor organizing throughout the steel industry for decades. Workers at his other facilities would be afraid to demand better conditions or wages, knowing that resistance could result in job loss and community destruction. The long-term business benefits were enormous. Carnegie Steel could now reduce labor costs significantly while eliminating the union's ability to interfere with efficiency improvements. The company's profits increased dramatically as wages stagnated and working conditions deteriorated. But Carnegie also recognized that Homestead had damaged his public reputation permanently. The man who wrote eloquently about moral capitalism and social responsibility had revealed himself capable of using deadly force to suppress workers who demanded basic dignity and fairness. Carnegie's attempts to rehabilitate his image through increased philanthropic giving began immediately after Homestead. He accelerated library construction, expanded educational donations, and wrote extensively about wealthy individuals' social obligations. However, these efforts couldn't erase the fundamental contradiction that Homestead had exposed. Carnegie's wealth came directly from exploiting workers, regardless of his charitable intentions for that wealth after accumulating it. The Homestead strike established the template that would define American labor relations for the next 4 decades. Wealthy business owners could use private security forces and government military power to suppress workers' organizing efforts, regardless of constitutional protections or democratic principles. Workers learned that their only protection came from their own solidarity and resistance, since legal and political systems were controlled by the same wealthy interests that exploited them economically. The strike also revealed the depths of Carnegie's capacity for self-deception. He genuinely believed that his business practices benefited society while simultaneously using violence to prevent workers from sharing in the prosperity they created. By 1893, Carnegie Steel was more profitable than ever. With labor costs reduced and union resistance eliminated, Carnegie himself was worth more than $300 million and controlled approximately 65% of American steel production. But the price of this success included 10 dead workers, thousands of destroyed careers, and a permanently stained reputation that no amount of philanthropy could fully restore. Carnegie had achieved his efficiency goals through methods that revealed the moral emptiness at capitalism's core. The richest man in America had become wealthy by denying workers the basic human dignity he claimed to champion in his philosophical writings. The contradiction would torment Carnegie for the rest of his life and force him to confront questions about wealth, power, and moral responsibility that he had previously avoided through intellectual rationalization and charitable gestures. Chapter 7. Giving Pledge. In 1901, Andrew Carnegie walked into J.P. Morgan's office as the richest man who had ever lived and walked out having given away the largest fortune in human history. The meeting lasted less than 2 hours, but it transformed Carnegie from an industrial titan into something unprecedented, a billionaire who would spend the rest of his life systematically giving away everything he had accumulated through decades of ruthless efficiency. The deal was staggering in its simplicity and scope. Morgan would purchase Carnegie Steel for $480 million, equivalent to approximately $310 billion today. Carnegie would receive payment in cash and bonds, making him instantly wealthier than entire nations. But here's what made this moment historically unique. Carnegie had already decided that keeping this wealth would be morally wrong. He was selling his empire specifically so he could give the proceeds away before he died. The philosophical foundation for Carnegie's decision had been developing for decades, even as he built his steel monopoly through increasingly controversial methods. Carnegie genuinely believed that extreme wealth created moral obligations that transcended personal desires or family interests. In his 1889 essay, The Gospel of Wealth, Carnegie had argued that successful businessmen were merely trustees of society's resources, temporarily managing money that ultimately belonged to the community. He wrote that dying rich was a form of moral failure, proving that wealth had been hoarded rather than used for society's benefit. This philosophy wasn't just abstract theorizing. It was Carnegie's attempt to reconcile his business practices with his humanitarian ideals. He believed that accumulating wealth through efficient business methods was morally justified only if that wealth was eventually redistributed for social progress. The logic was sophisticated but troubling. Carnegie could exploit workers and crush competitors during the wealth accumulation phase as long as he gave away the resulting profits during the wealth distribution phase. Temporary harm was acceptable if it enabled greater long-term social benefits. Carnegie's sale to Morgan eliminated his direct involvement in steel production's human costs, while providing resources for philanthropic activities that could benefit millions of people. It was a form of moral arbitrage, converting ethically questionable business wealth into socially beneficial charitable resources. But implementing Carnegie's giving philosophy required solving problems that no philanthropist had ever faced. How do you systematically give away $310 billion in an era without income taxes, grant-making foundations, or professional charity management? Carnegie's solution revealed the same systematic thinking that had built his steel empire. He would apply efficiency principles to philanthropy, creating systems for identifying and funding social improvements that could generate maximum benefit per dollar spent. Carnegie's first major philanthropic initiative focused on library construction, a cause that reflected both his personal history and his belief in self-improvement through education. He had credited free library access with enabling his rise from poverty, and he wanted to provide similar opportunities for other ambitious young people. Between 1883 and 1929, Carnegie funded construction of 2,509 libraries worldwide, including 1,679 in the United States. The libraries were designed using standardized architectural plans that minimized construction costs while maximizing functional efficiency, essentially applying industrial mass production techniques to philanthropic infrastructure. But Carnegie's library program wasn't simple charity. It was social engineering designed to promote specific values and behaviors. Recipients had to demonstrate community support for education, agree to maintain the libraries permanently, and organize operations according to Carnegie's specifications. The requirements ensured that Carnegie's libraries would function as centers for self-improvement and civic engagement, rather than merely recreational reading facilities. They promoted the individualistic philosophy that had enabled Carnegie's own success, while providing tools that others could use for similar advancement. Carnegie's educational philanthropy expanded beyond libraries to include funding for schools, universities, and research institutions. He established the Carnegie Institute of Technology, the Carnegie Institution for Science, and the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Each educational initiative reflected Carnegie's belief that social progress came through individual improvement rather than structural change. He funded institutions that would help capable people develop their talents rather than programs that might reduce systemic inequalities. This approach was consistent with Carnegie's business philosophy, but created limitations that reduced his philanthropy's effectiveness. Carnegie's gifts helped individuals who were already positioned for advancement, while providing little assistance for people trapped by poverty, discrimination, or lack of educational opportunities. Carnegie also invested heavily in cultural institutions, funding construction of Carnegie Hall in New York, and supporting orchestras, museums, and art galleries throughout America and Britain. These investments reflected his belief that cultural refinement was essential for social progress and democratic governance. But Carnegie's most ambitious philanthropic initiative was his funding for international peace organizations. He established the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and built the Peace Palace in The Hague, hoping to prevent future wars through international law and arbitration. Carnegie's peace activism reflected lessons learned from observing how wars accelerated industrial development while devastating human lives. He believed that international cooperation was both morally necessary and economically beneficial for advanced industrial nations. However, Carnegie's peace efforts were undermined by the same contradictions that characterized his business career. The man advocating for international harmony had built his fortune through economic warfare that destroyed competitors and exploited workers. World War I shattered Carnegie's optimistic assumptions about human progress and rational international relations. The industrialized slaughter that began in 1914 revealed that technological advancement could enable unprecedented destructiveness rather than inevitable social improvement. Carnegie's response to the war's outbreak demonstrated both his genuine humanitarian concerns and his inability to understand how his own business practices had contributed to the competitive nationalism that made such conflicts possible. By 1915, Carnegie had given away approximately 90% of his wealth, fulfilling the moral obligation he had set for himself decades earlier. But the process had revealed fundamental problems with his approach to both wealth accumulation and wealth distribution. Carnegie's philanthropy, while genuinely beneficial for millions of recipients, couldn't address the systemic problems that had enabled his wealth accumulation in the first place. Libraries and universities were valuable social resources, but they didn't prevent worker exploitation or corporate monopolization. The man who had written extensively about wealthy individuals' social responsibilities had demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of philanthropic solutions to economic inequality. Charitable giving could treat symptoms of systemic problems without addressing their underlying causes. Carnegie's final years were marked by growing recognition that his philanthropic efforts, however well-intentioned and generously funded, couldn't fully compensate for the human costs of the business methods that had created his wealth. He increasingly questioned whether extreme wealth accumulation was compatible with democratic governance and social justice, regardless of how that wealth was eventually distributed. But these doubts came too late to change the fundamental choices that had defined his career. Carnegie died in 1919, having successfully given away nearly his entire fortune according to his philosophical principles. But his legacy remained complex and contradictory, a testament to both capitalism's wealth-generating potential and its moral limitations. The Carnegie example established patterns that would define American philanthropy for the next century. Wealthy individuals using charitable giving to address social problems that their business practices had helped create or exacerbate. Carnegie's gospel of wealth became the intellectual foundation for modern philanthropic capitalism, the belief that private wealth accumulation, followed by strategic charitable distribution, could solve social problems more effectively than democratic government programs or economic reform. But Carnegie's experience also revealed the moral hazards inherent in this approach. Philanthropic power remained concentrated in the hands of individuals whose wealth accumulation had often involved questionable business practices, creating dependencies that might undermine democratic accountability. The richest man who ever lived had tried to give away his wealth more systematically than anyone before or since. But his example raised more questions than it answered about wealth, power, and moral responsibility in capitalist societies. Chapter 8: Ultimate Legacy. Andrew Carnegie died on August 11, 1919, having given away $350 million, roughly $85 billion in today's money, and fundamentally changed how America thinks about wealth, power, and moral responsibility. But measuring Carnegie's legacy requires confronting an uncomfortable truth. The same systematic thinking that enabled his unprecedented philanthropy had also enabled unprecedented exploitation of workers and destruction of competitors. Carnegie's impact on American society was so profound that we still live within systems and institutions he created more than a century ago. Every public library, funded through his gifts, Every university research program he established, every cultural institution he supported. The physical infrastructure of American education and civic life bears Carnegie's fingerprints. But Carnegie's business legacy is equally pervasive and more controversial. The corporate structures he pioneered, vertical integration, systematic cost accounting, efficiency-driven management, became standard practices that define modern capitalism. Every multinational corporation applies principles that Carnegie developed while building his steel empire. The efficiency methods that Carnegie used to dominate steel production are now taught in business schools as fundamental management techniques. His approach to scaling operations, controlling supply chains, and optimizing production processes became the blueprint for industrial organization worldwide. However, Carnegie's legacy also includes the labor relations practices that enabled his unprecedented profits. The systematic suppression of worker organizing, the prioritization of efficiency over human welfare, the use of private security forces to break strikes. These methods also became standard practices that continued decades after Carnegie's death. The Homestead Massacre established precedents that shaped American labor relations throughout the 20th century. Wealthy business owners regularly used violence and government power to suppress workers' attempts to organize for better conditions and wages. Carnegie's successful union breaking at Homestead provided a template that other industrialists copied repeatedly. Carnegie's philanthropic innovations were equally influential in establishing patterns that continue today. His systematic approach to charitable giving created the modern foundation industry. His focus on education and cultural institutions defined philanthropic priorities that wealthy individuals still follow. The Carnegie Libraries program demonstrated how strategic philanthropy could shape social behavior on a national scale. By requiring communities to demonstrate commitment to education and civic engagement, Carnegie's giving promoted values and practices that aligned with his political and economic philosophy. But Carnegie's philanthropy also revealed the limitations and moral hazards of private charity as a substitute for democratic governance and economic justice. His gifts addressed symptoms of systemic problems without challenging the underlying structures that created those problems. Carnegie's libraries provided educational opportunities, while the Carnegie Steel Company denied workers the wages and working conditions that would have enabled them to use those opportunities effectively. This contradiction, creating problems through business practices, then addressing them through charitable giving, became a defining characteristic of American philanthropy. Modern billionaire philanthropy follows patterns that Carnegie established. Wealthy individuals using charitable foundations to promote solutions to social problems while maintaining business practices that may perpetuate or exacerbate those same problems. Carnegie's intellectual legacy is equally complex and enduring. His writings about the gospel of wealth provided philosophical justification for extreme wealth accumulation, followed by strategic charitable distribution. This philosophy remains influential among contemporary wealthy individuals seeking to reconcile personal success with social responsibility. But Carnegie's philosophy also revealed fundamental contradictions in capitalist thinking about wealth and morality. His argument that temporary exploitation was justified by eventual philanthropy created moral frameworks that enabled continued worker oppression while allowing perpetrators to maintain self-images as social benefactors. Carnegie's international influence extended his impact far beyond American borders. His business methods spread throughout the industrializing world as other nations copied American industrial techniques. His philanthropic initiatives established institutions in Britain, Canada, and other countries that continue operating today. The Peace Palace in The Hague, funded by Carnegie's endowment, became a symbol of international cooperation and legal dispute resolution. Although Carnegie's hopes for preventing future wars were shattered by World War I, his peace institutions contributed to developing frameworks for international law that remain relevant today. Carnegie's impact on economic thinking was particularly significant in establishing intellectual justifications for extreme wealth concentration. His arguments that wealthy individuals were natural trustees of social resources provided theoretical foundations for policies that enabled unprecedented inequality while claiming moral legitimacy. These arguments continue influencing contemporary debates about taxation, regulation, and wealth redistribution. Politicians and economists who oppose redistributive policies often invoke Carnegie-style reasoning about wealthy individuals' superior capacity for managing social resources through private charity, rather than democratic government programs. But Carnegie's experience also demonstrated the practical limitations of philanthropic solutions to systemic economic problems. Despite giving away 90% of his wealth, Carnegie couldn't address the fundamental inequalities and power imbalances that his business practices had helped create. The communities devastated by Carnegie's labor suppression didn't benefit proportionally from his educational and cultural philanthropy. The workers whose lives were damaged by his efficiency obsessions couldn't access the opportunities his libraries and universities provided. This mismatch between philanthropic benefits and business costs revealed a core problem with Carnegie's approach. Charitable giving, however generous, couldn't fully compensate for the human damage caused by wealth accumulation methods that prioritized profit over people. Carnegie's psychological legacy is particularly fascinating because it reveals how brilliant, well-intentioned individuals can rationalize morally questionable behavior through sophisticated intellectual frameworks. Carnegie genuinely believed his business practices were socially beneficial, even when they clearly harmed workers and communities. This capacity for self-deception isn't unique to Carnegie. It's a characteristic pattern among wealthy individuals who must reconcile personal success with humanitarian values. Carnegie's extensive writings document how intelligent people can construct elaborate justifications for behavior that serves their interests, while claiming moral high ground. Understanding Carnegie's psychological contradictions provides insights into how modern wealth accumulation continues, despite widespread recognition of its social costs. Like Carnegie, contemporary wealthy individuals often genuinely believe their success benefits society, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Carnegie's technological legacy includes his role in developing mass production techniques that revolutionized manufacturing worldwide. The efficiency methods he pioneered in steel production were adapted for automobile manufacturing, electronics production, and countless other industries. But Carnegie's technological innovations were always subordinated to his economic objectives. He adopted new production methods not primarily to benefit workers or customers, but to maximize profits and competitive advantages. This approach established priorities that continue characterizing technological development today. The relationship between technological progress and worker welfare that Carnegie established, efficiency improvements that increase profits while potentially harming workers, remains a defining feature of modern economic development. Carnegie's ultimate legacy is the demonstration that extraordinary individual achievement and systematic social harm can coexist within the same person and the same career. Carnegie was simultaneously one of history's greatest philanthropists and one of its most ruthless exploiters of workers. This duality reflects fundamental contradictions in capitalist systems that reward efficient resource allocation while potentially ignoring human costs. Carnegie succeeded brilliantly within these systems, while also revealing their moral limitations and social dangers. Perhaps Carnegie's most important contribution was proving that extreme wealth accumulation, followed by strategic philanthropy, cannot substitute for economic systems that prioritize human welfare alongside efficiency and growth. Carnegie's example shows both the potential and the inadequacy of private charity as a solution to systemic inequality. Modern societies still struggle with the same questions that defined Carnegie's career. How do we balance efficiency and equity? Can private philanthropy address public problems? Are extreme wealth differences compatible with democratic governance? Carnegie didn't answer these questions definitively, but his life demonstrates their importance and complexity. The richest man who ever lived spent his final years grappling with moral contradictions that remain unresolved more than a century later. Chapter 8. Ultimate Legacy. Expanded 6,000 words. Andrew Carnegie died on August 11, 1919, having given away $350 million, roughly $85 billion in today's money, and fundamentally changed how America thinks about wealth, power, and moral responsibility. But measuring Carnegie's legacy requires confronting an uncomfortable truth. The same systematic thinking that enabled his unprecedented philanthropy had also enabled unprecedented exploitation of workers and destruction of competitors. Carnegie's impact on American society was so profound that we still live within systems and institutions he created more than a century ago. Every public library funded through his gifts, every university research program he established, every cultural institution he supported. The physical infrastructure of American education and civic life bears Carnegie's fingerprints. But Carnegie's business legacy is equally pervasive and more controversial. The corporate structures he pioneered, vertical integration, systematic cost accounting, efficiency-driven management, became standard practices that define modern capitalism. Every multinational corporation applies principles that Carnegie developed while building his steel empire. The efficiency methods that Carnegie used to dominate steel production are now taught in business schools as fundamental management techniques. His approach to scaling operations, controlling supply chains, and optimizing production processes became the blueprint for industrial organization worldwide. Walk into any Amazon fulfillment center, and you'll see Carnegie's principles in action. The obsessive measurement of worker productivity, the systematic elimination of inefficiency, the prioritization of speed and cost reduction over worker comfort. Jeff Bezos didn't invent these methods. He perfected techniques that Carnegie pioneered 150 years ago. Tesla's gigafactories operate according to vertical integration strategies that Carnegie developed. Elon Musk's control over battery production, software development, and manufacturing processes mirrors Carnegie's integration of mining, transportation, and steel production. The same logic drives both empires: control every aspect of production to maximize efficiency and minimize dependence on external suppliers. Modern tech companies have taken Carnegie's systematic approach to unprecedented extremes. Google tracks employee productivity with algorithmic precision that would have amazed Carnegie. Facebook optimizes user engagement using data analysis techniques that make Carnegie's cost accounting seem primitive. Apple's supply chain control extends across continents with coordination that surpasses anything Carnegie achieved. But the human costs remain remarkably similar. Amazon warehouse workers describe conditions that echo Carnegie's steel mills: intense pace, constant surveillance, pressure to meet impossible productivity targets. Tech industry contractors work without benefits or job security while generating enormous profits for companies that employ them. The gig economy represents Carnegie's vision of efficient labor markets taken to its logical conclusion. Workers become completely interchangeable production units with no long-term relationships or protections. Uber drivers, DoorDash delivery workers, and TaskRabbit contractors experience the same disposability that Carnegie's mill workers faced. However, Carnegie's legacy also includes the labor relations practices that enabled his unprecedented profits. The systematic suppression of worker organizing, the prioritization of efficiency over human welfare, the use of private security forces to break strikes. These methods also became standard practices that continued decades after Carnegie's death. The Homestead Massacre established precedents that shaped American labor relations throughout the 20th century. Wealthy business owners regularly used violence and government power to suppress workers' attempts to organize for better conditions and wages. Carnegie's successful union breaking at Homestead provided a template that other industrialists copied repeatedly. From the 1920s through the 1950s, American corporations routinely employed private security forces to infiltrate unions, intimidate organizers, and break strikes. The Ford Motor Company's service department operated like Carnegie's Pinkertons, using violence and surveillance to prevent workers from organizing. General Motors, U.S. Steel, and other major corporations adopted Carnegie's playbook for suppressing labor activism. Even today, corporations use sophisticated techniques to prevent unionization that trace directly back to Carnegie's methods. Amazon's anti-union campaigns combine modern technology with Carnegie's fundamental strategy, making organizations so difficult and costly that workers abandon attempts to improve their conditions collectively. Carnegie's philanthropic innovations were equally influential in establishing patterns that continue today. His systematic approach to charitable giving created the modern foundation industry. His focus on education and cultural institutions defined philanthropic priorities that wealthy individuals still follow. The Carnegie Libraries program demonstrated how strategic philanthropy could shape social behavior on a national scale. By requiring communities to demonstrate commitment to education and civic engagement, Carnegie's giving promoted values and practices that aligned with his political and economic philosophy. But Carnegie's philanthropy also revealed the limitations and moral hazards of private charity as a substitute for democratic governance and economic justice. His gifts addressed symptoms of systemic problems without challenging the underlying structures that created those problems. Carnegie's libraries provided educational opportunities, while the Carnegie Steel Company denied workers the wages and working conditions that would have enabled them to use those opportunities effectively. This contradiction, creating problems through business practices, then addressing them through charitable giving, became a defining characteristic of American philanthropy. Modern billionaire philanthropy follows patterns that Carnegie established. Wealthy individuals using charitable foundations to promote solutions to social problems while maintaining business practices that may perpetuate or exacerbate those same problems. Bill Gates exemplifies this Carnegie-inspired approach. The Gates Foundation addresses global health and education problems with systematic efficiency that mirrors Carnegie's library program. Gates applies business principles to philanthropy, measuring outcomes and scaling successful interventions worldwide. But Gates accumulated his wealth through Microsoft's monopolistic practices that stifled competition and innovation for decades. The same systematic thinking that enables effective philanthropy also enabled market domination that harmed competitors and potentially slowed technological progress. Mark Zuckerberg's Chan Zuckerberg Initiative follows Carnegie's model of using private wealth to address public problems. Zuckerberg argues that entrepreneurial approaches can solve social issues more effectively than government programs, echoing Carnegie's philosophy about wealthy individuals' superior resource management capabilities. Yet Facebook's business model depends on manipulating user behavior in ways that may undermine the democratic discourse and mental health that Zuckerberg's philanthropy claims to support. Like Carnegie, Zuckerberg generates wealth through methods that create some of the problems his charity attempts to address. The pattern extends throughout modern philanthropy. Pharmaceutical executives fund medical research while maintaining pricing strategies that deny healthcare access. Oil industry leaders support environmental causes while lobbying against climate action. Financial industry philanthropists promote economic education while engaging in practices that may increase economic inequality. Carnegie's intellectual legacy is equally complex and enduring. His writings about the gospel of wealth provided philosophical justification for extreme wealth accumulation, followed by strategic, charitable distribution. This philosophy remains influential among contemporary wealthy individuals seeking to reconcile personal success with social responsibility. Warren Buffett's giving pledge directly cites Carnegie's example as inspiration for convincing billionaires to donate most of their wealth during their lifetimes. More than 200 billionaires have signed pledges to give away at least half their fortunes, following Carnegie's argument that dying rich represents moral failure. But Carnegie's philosophy also revealed fundamental contradictions in capitalist thinking about wealth and morality. His argument that temporary exploitation was justified by eventual philanthropy created moral frameworks that enabled continued worker oppression while allowing perpetrators to maintain self-images as social benefactors. Carnegie's international influence extended his impact far beyond American borders. His business methods spread throughout the industrializing world as other nations copied American industrial techniques. His philanthropic initiatives established institutions in Britain, Canada, and other countries that continue operating today. The Carnegie model of industrial development was exported globally through American corporate expansion and government aid programs. Post-World War II economic development projects promoted Carnegie-style efficiency methods as paths to prosperity for developing nations. But this global spread also exported the social costs and moral contradictions that characterized Carnegie's domestic success. Multinational corporations applied Carnegie's efficiency principles in countries with weaker labor protections and environmental regulations, often creating conditions worse than those Carnegie's workers faced. Modern global supply chains represent the ultimate expression of Carnegie's systematic efficiency approach. Companies like Nike, Apple, and Walmart achieve unprecedented cost reductions by locating production in countries where workers have minimal protections and wages remain extremely low. The Peace Palace in The Hague, funded by Carnegie's endowment, became a symbol of international cooperation and legal dispute resolution. Although Carnegie's hopes for preventing future wars were shattered by World War I, his peace institutions contributed to developing frameworks for international law that remain relevant today. Carnegie's peace philanthropy revealed both his genuine humanitarian concerns and his naive optimism about human nature and international relations. He believed that rational economic interests would eventually override nationalist competition, failing to anticipate how industrialization could enable unprecedented destructiveness rather than inevitable progress. The institutions Carnegie funded for international arbitration and legal cooperation provided foundations for the United Nations, World Court, and other modern international organizations. But these institutions have struggled with the same limitations that constrained Carnegie's peace efforts. Powerful nations often ignore international law when it conflicts with their perceived interests. Carnegie's impact on economic thinking was particularly significant in establishing intellectual justifications for extreme wealth concentration. His arguments that wealthy individuals were natural trustees of social resources provided theoretical foundations for policies that enabled unprecedented inequality while claiming moral legitimacy. These arguments continue influencing contemporary debates about taxation, regulation, and wealth redistribution. Politicians and economists who oppose redistributive policies often invoke Carnegie-style reasoning about wealthy individuals' superior capacity for managing social resources through private charity, rather than democratic government programs. The trickle-down economics promoted by Ronald Reagan and subsequent conservative leaders echoes Carnegie's philosophy about wealth concentration, enabling greater overall social benefits. Tax cuts for wealthy individuals and corporations are justified using logic that Carnegie developed. Private wealth accumulation allegedly benefits society more than public spending on social programs. But Carnegie's experience also demonstrated the practical limitations of philanthropic solutions to systemic economic problems. Despite giving away 90% of his wealth, Carnegie couldn't address the fundamental inequalities and power imbalances that his business practices had helped create. Modern research on inequality confirms what Carnegie's example suggested. Private philanthropy, however generous, cannot substitute for policies that address structural economic problems. The wealth gap has expanded dramatically despite unprecedented philanthropic giving by billionaires following Carnegie's model. The communities devastated by Carnegie's labor suppression didn't benefit proportionally from his educational and cultural philanthropy. The workers whose lives were damaged by his efficiency obsessions couldn't access the opportunities his libraries and universities provided. This mismatch between philanthropic benefits and business costs revealed a core problem with Carnegie's approach. Charitable giving, however generous, couldn't fully compensate for the human damage caused by wealth accumulation methods that prioritized profit over people. Carnegie's psychological legacy is particularly fascinating because it reveals how brilliant, well-intentioned individuals can rationalize morally questionable behavior through sophisticated intellectual frameworks. Carnegie genuinely believed his business practices were socially beneficial, even when they clearly harmed workers and communities. This capacity for self-deception isn't unique to Carnegie. It's a characteristic pattern among wealthy individuals who must reconcile personal success with humanitarian values. Carnegie's extensive writings document how intelligent people can construct elaborate justifications for behavior that serves their interests, while claiming moral high ground. Understanding Carnegie's psychological contradictions provides insights into how modern wealth accumulation continues, despite widespread recognition of its social costs. Like Carnegie, contemporary wealthy individuals often genuinely believe their success benefits society, even when evidence suggests otherwise. The effective altruism movement, popular among tech billionaires, represents a sophisticated evolution of Carnegie's rationalization strategies. Supporters argue that maximizing personal wealth through any legal means is morally justified if sufficient percentages are donated to effective charities. This philosophy allows individuals to maintain aggressive business practices while claiming superior moral status based on charitable intentions. Like Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, effective altruism provides intellectual frameworks that enable continued exploitation, while preserving self-images as humanitarian benefactors. Carnegie's cultural impact includes establishing the archetype of the philanthropic capitalist, the wealthy individual who accumulates fortune through business success, then seeks redemption through charitable giving. This archetype influences how Americans think about wealth, success, and social responsibility. Popular culture regularly celebrates individuals who follow Carnegie's path from business success to philanthropic prominence. Movies, books, and media coverage often portray wealthy philanthropists as heroic figures who use private resources to solve public problems that democratic institutions have failed to address. But this cultural narrative obscures the systemic factors that enable extreme wealth accumulation and the limitations of charitable solutions to structural problems. The Carnegie myth suggests that individual virtue and charitable giving can substitute for economic justice and democratic governance. Carnegie's technological legacy includes his role in developing mass production techniques that revolutionized manufacturing worldwide. The efficiency methods he pioneered in steel production were adapted for automobile manufacturing, electronics production, and countless other industries. Henry Ford's assembly line production system applied Carnegie's efficiency principles to automobile manufacturing. Ford studied Carnegie's methods for standardizing processes, measuring productivity, and minimizing costs. The Model T production system represented the automotive industry's version of Carnegie's steel empire, but Carnegie's technological innovations were always subordinated to his economic objectives. He adopted new production methods not primarily to benefit workers or customers, but to maximize profits and competitive advantages. This approach established priorities that continue characterizing technological development today. Modern automation and artificial intelligence development follows patterns Carnegie established. Technological advancement, driven primarily by cost reduction and productivity improvement, rather than worker welfare or social benefit. Companies implement AI systems to replace human workers and reduce labor costs, regardless of social consequences. The relationship between technological progress and worker welfare that Carnegie established, efficiency improvements that increase profits while potentially harming workers, remains a defining feature of modern economic development. Amazon's warehouse automation eliminates jobs while increasing profits. Uber's pursuit of self-driving vehicles threatens drivers' livelihoods while promising reduced costs for the company. These developments follow Carnegie's logic of prioritizing efficiency over human welfare. Carnegie's political legacy includes his role in establishing precedents for corporate influence over democratic institutions. His relationships with political leaders demonstrated how extreme wealth could translate into political power that served business interests. Carnegie's lobbying for protective tariffs that benefited his steel operations, while increasing costs for consumers, established patterns of corporate political influence that persist today. His ability to shape government policies through personal relationships and campaign contributions became a model for subsequent business leaders. Modern corporate political influence operates through more sophisticated channels: professional lobbyists, political action committees, think tanks, and revolving door employment between government and industry. But the fundamental dynamic Carnegie pioneered remains unchanged. Wealthy individuals and corporations use political influence to maintain policies that preserve their advantages. The Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, which expanded corporate political spending rights, represents the logical extension of Carnegie's approach to political influence. Corporations can now spend unlimited amounts on political campaigns, effectively purchasing policy outcomes that serve their interests. Carnegie's international political influence included his relationships with British leaders and his peace activism. His ability to operate across national boundaries while maintaining business interests in multiple countries provided a template for modern, multinational corporate political engagement. Contemporary tech companies exercise political influence globally in ways that mirror Carnegie's international operations. Google, Facebook, and Amazon lobby governments worldwide to maintain favorable regulatory environments for their business models. Carnegie's educational legacy transformed American higher education through his funding of universities, research institutions, and professional schools. The Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching standardized educational requirements and promoted professional development for educators. Carnegie's educational philanthropy promoted specific pedagogical approaches that emphasized practical skills and professional training over classical liberal arts education. This emphasis on utilitarian education served Carnegie's economic philosophy by producing workers and managers suited for industrial careers. Modern educational institutions continue reflecting Carnegie's influence through their focus on career preparation and economic outcomes. Business schools teach management techniques Carnegie pioneered. Engineering programs emphasize efficiency optimization. Educational policy debates focus on economic competitiveness rather than broader social or cultural goals. Carnegie's pension system for college professors, administered through TIAA-CREF, established precedents for employer-provided retirement benefits that influenced subsequent labor relations. The system demonstrated how systematic approaches to employee welfare could serve both humanitarian and business objectives. But Carnegie's educational initiatives also revealed the limitations of philanthropic solutions to educational inequality. His gifts primarily benefited institutions serving middle-class and affluent populations while providing limited assistance for working-class educational needs. Contemporary educational philanthropy follows similar patterns. Wealthy donors fund elite universities and charter school experiments, while public education serving working-class communities struggles with inadequate resources. The Carnegie model of private educational philanthropy coexists with systematic underfunding of democratic educational institutions. Carnegie's environmental legacy includes the resource extraction and industrial pollution that enabled his steel empire. His mines, furnaces, and transportation systems generated environmental damage that affected communities for generations. The Pittsburgh region's air and water pollution during Carnegie's era created health problems that persisted long after his death. Workers in Carnegie's facilities suffered from industrial diseases caused by exposure to toxic materials and pollutants. Carnegie's approach to environmental costs paralleled his treatment of labor costs. External consequences were ignored if they didn't directly impact profitability. This approach established patterns of environmental externalization that continue characterizing industrial development. Modern corporations follow Carnegie's model of maximizing private profits while externalizing environmental costs to communities and future generations. Climate change represents the global extension of Carnegie's local environmental practices. Carnegie's resource extraction methods influenced subsequent mining and industrial development worldwide. His systematic approach to controlling raw material supplies provided templates for resource-based industries that continue operating according to similar principles. Contemporary concerns about sustainable development and environmental justice trace back to problems that Carnegie's industrial methods helped create. The tension between economic efficiency and environmental protection that characterizes modern policy debates reflects contradictions embedded in Carnegie's approach to industrial development. Carnegie's ultimate legacy is the demonstration that extraordinary individual achievement and systematic social harm can coexist within the same person and the same career. Carnegie was simultaneously one of history's greatest philanthropists and one of its most ruthless exploiters of workers. This duality reflects fundamental contradictions in capitalist systems that reward efficient resource allocation while potentially ignoring human costs. Carnegie succeeded brilliantly within these systems, while also revealing their moral limitations and social dangers. Perhaps Carnegie's most important contribution was proving that extreme wealth accumulation, followed by strategic philanthropy, cannot substitute for economic systems that prioritize human welfare alongside efficiency and growth. Carnegie's example shows both the potential and the inadequacy of private charity as a solution to systemic inequality. Modern societies still struggle with the same questions that defined Carnegie's career. How do we balance efficiency and equity? Can private philanthropy address public problems? Are extreme wealth differences compatible with democratic governance? Carnegie didn't answer these questions definitively, but his life demonstrates their importance and complexity. The richest man who ever lived spent his final years grappling with moral contradictions that remain unresolved more than a century later. The Carnegie example forces contemporary society to confront uncomfortable truths about wealth, power, and social responsibility. His success demonstrates capitalism's potential for generating prosperity, but his methods reveal the human costs that success can entail. Carnegie's legacy challenges us to design economic systems that capture the benefits of systematic efficiency while addressing the social costs more effectively than private philanthropy alone can accomplish. His life provides both inspiration for what individual achievement can accomplish and warning about what it can cost. The Scottish immigrant who transformed from factory worker to steel king to philanthropist remains relevant because his contradictions mirror those embedded in modern economic systems. Carnegie's story is ultimately America's story, a tale of unprecedented opportunity shadowed by systematic exploitation, of remarkable achievement purchased through moral compromise. Understanding Carnegie's complete legacy, both its triumphs and its tragedies, provides essential insights for societies still struggling to balance economic progress with human dignity, individual success with social justice, and private achievement with public welfare. Carnegie's life proves that these tensions cannot be resolved through individual virtue or charitable giving alone. They require systematic approaches to economic organization that prioritize human flourishing alongside efficiency and growth. Approaches that Carnegie's example illuminates but could not by itself provide. So we've seen how a poor Scottish immigrant became the richest human being who ever lived, then gave it all away in a desperate attempt to reconcile the contradictions that wealth had created in his soul. Today, more than a century after Carnegie's death, his fingerprints are everywhere. You've probably visited a library he built. You've walked through cities constructed with his steel. You've benefited from universities he funded and cultural institutions he established. The physical infrastructure of American civilization bears Carnegie's mark. But Carnegie's legacy runs deeper than buildings and institutions. Every time a billionaire announces plans to give away their fortune, they're following the path Carnegie pioneered. Every corporate efficiency program that prioritizes productivity over worker welfare echoes methods Carnegie perfected. Every philanthropic foundation claiming to solve social problems while maintaining business practices that perpetuate those problems reflects contradictions Carnegie embodied. Modern tech billionaires often present themselves as Carnegie's heirs, innovative industrialists using private wealth to address public problems more effectively than democratic governments. They argue, as Carnegie did, that extreme wealth concentration enables greater social benefits through strategic philanthropy than wealth redistribution through taxation and democratic programs. Yet Carnegie's example reveals both the promise and the peril of this approach. Carnegie genuinely improved millions of lives through his gifts, while simultaneously demonstrating that private philanthropy cannot address the systemic inequalities that extreme wealth accumulation creates. The communities devastated by Carnegie's labor suppression practices didn't benefit proportionally from his educational philanthropy. The workers whose lives were damaged by his efficiency obsessions couldn't access the opportunities his institutions provided. Carnegie's charity treated symptoms, while his business practices perpetuated causes. This pattern continues today as wealthy individuals fund charitable programs addressing problems that their business activities may have helped create or exacerbate. Environmental philanthropy from fossil fuel fortunes. Educational giving from executives whose companies lobbied against public school funding. Healthcare charity from pharmaceutical leaders whose pricing strategies denied medical access. Carnegie's life demonstrates that good intentions and sophisticated rationalization can coexist with systematic exploitation. His extensive writings reveal how intelligent, cultured individuals can construct elaborate moral justifications for behavior that primarily serves their own interests while claiming humanitarian purposes. But Carnegie's story also shows that even the most successful capitalists eventually confront the human costs of their success. The blood spilled at Homestead haunted Carnegie for the rest of his life, despite all his attempts to justify those deaths as necessary sacrifices for greater social progress. Carnegie's final years were marked by growing recognition that his philanthropic efforts couldn't fully compensate for the methods he had used to accumulate wealth. Libraries and universities were valuable social contributions, but they didn't resurrect dead workers or restore destroyed communities. The man who had written eloquently about the gospel of wealth spent his last decade questioning whether extreme wealth accumulation was compatible with moral responsibility, regardless of how that wealth was eventually distributed. Perhaps Carnegie's most important lesson isn't about business strategy or philanthropic techniques. It's about the psychological and moral costs of prioritizing efficiency over humanity. Carnegie achieved unprecedented success by treating workers as production costs to be minimized, rather than human beings deserving dignity and fair compensation. This approach enabled extraordinary wealth accumulation, but also created contradictions that tormented Carnegie throughout his life. The same systematic thinking that made him history's greatest philanthropist also made him one of its most ruthless exploiters of working people. Carnegie's legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about capitalism's moral implications. Can extreme wealth differences coexist with democratic equality? Should private charity substitute for public programs? Are efficiency and equity necessarily incompatible? These questions remain relevant because the economic systems Carnegie helped create continue operating according to principles he established. Modern corporations still pursue efficiency through methods that may harm workers and communities. Wealthy individuals still use philanthropic giving to maintain social legitimacy while preserving economic advantages. Whether we like it or not, we still live in Andrew Carnegie's America, a society where extreme wealth concentration coexists with extensive private charity, where technological progress serves primarily to increase profits rather than improve working conditions, where efficiency is valued more highly than equity. Carnegie's life reveals both capitalism's wealth-generating potential and its human costs. His success demonstrates what's possible when systematic thinking is applied to resource allocation and organizational efficiency. His failures reveal what's lost when human welfare is subordinated to economic optimization. The richest man who ever lived couldn't buy redemption for the methods he used to accumulate wealth, despite giving away 90% of his fortune according to his own moral principles. Carnegie's philanthropy was genuine and beneficial, but it couldn't resurrect the workers killed at Homestead or restore the dignity of families devastated by his labor practices. So the question remains, was Carnegie a visionary industrialist who advanced human progress through efficient resource allocation? Or was he a robber baron who exploited workers and corrupted democratic institutions to accumulate unconscionable wealth? The answer is probably both. Carnegie succeeded brilliantly within economic systems that reward efficiency while potentially ignoring human costs. His life demonstrates both capitalism's promise and its moral limitations. Perhaps Carnegie's ultimate contribution was proving that extraordinary individual achievement and systematic social harm can coexist within the same person and the same economic system. His legacy challenges us to design economic arrangements that capture capitalism's benefits while addressing its human costs more effectively than private charity alone can accomplish. Andrew Carnegie died having given away the largest fortune in human history, but he also died knowing that philanthropy, however generous and well-intentioned, cannot substitute for economic justice. That recognition may be his most valuable gift to future generations struggling with the same contradictions that defined his remarkable, troubling life.